Hello everyone. Today I wish to discuss with you a very common complaint that many people make about religions. Um, and that complaint happens to be that religion is something which necessarily promotes extremism or violence towards other people, in particular believers of other religions or people with no belief, no religious belief, that is. For many years, I was one of the people who shared this kind of conception. I grew up in Pakistan, which is a fairly religious country, I must say, and I had a first-hand experience of how religion can can be used, in fact, as a rationalization for gross crimes, huge, terrible crimes. When I was in Pakistan, some years back, there was a huge wave of sectarian killings once, where religious minorities, were singled out and killed by certain religious outfits. So I'm a sort of person who knows this from a personal experience that religion can be used as a means for violent activities. But should we disregard religion simply on the basis that certain people use religion as a basis for their violent actions? If so, why do we need to apply this standard only to religion? I believe that many things can be a source of violence. For example, even a thing as insignificant, personally, for me, as football can often be a source for violence. Sure enough, people who like football uh, don't go around launching crusades or jihad against people who people who prefer a different football club. But still, when the passions are high, we have seen that even the football enthusiasts can be rather aggressive towards others. So this the violence is not something which stems from one kind of activity. Rather, it is something which is biologically rooted in us. We can be violent human beings. Compassion, mercy is also rooted in us, but so is violence. I'm not here trying to justify or rationalize violence. We should try to downplay and try to minimize violence. In fact, try to eradicate violence, even if it's more of an philosophical abstraction. I'm not sure if it's even possible, but still, our standard should always be that in this world, we should try to eradicate violence. But it's not religion per se which leads to violence. For example, as I said, sports can lead to violence, can be used for violent means, and so can other beliefs. Look at what has transpired in the world since the French Revolution. Much of the crimes that have been committed against humanity have been under the banner of secular causes. Should that Does that mean that we should dismiss those secular ideas, some of which were thoroughly genuine and thoroughly virtuous, such as socialism, as inherently violent? Or rather, should we only focus on those particular communities who used those secular ideas to cause great many number of crimes? To begin with, capitalism, for example, has been used for violence. Liberal democracies, liberalism has been used as a source of violence. So, for example, we know that the American interventions in many different countries have often been um, under the idea, or under the advertisement at least, that that the US or the West wishes to install liberal democracies in other cultures. And that has often come at a huge human cost. But that doesn't necessarily mean the liberal democracy has to promote violence. Now, again, Bolsheviks, for example, killed millions of people in Russia and much of the Eastern and Central Europe. But that doesn't really mean that socialism itself is something that is violent. In fact, if taken in its right way, and if taken in a much more balanced and moderate way, socialism is, in my view, a fairly good idea. Then we see that in the 20th century was by far the most secularized and atheistic kind of century that we ever had, that humans have ever had. Although there are certain technicalities in that issue, and I can't discuss that in this video. Although I do disagree with this thesis that we are now living in a godless world. I just simply believe that we don't believe in God, but we believe in a lot of suppositions that are derived from religions. But that I will discuss in some other occasion. But generally, it is true that the 20th century was a very secularized period. But this was also a period where we saw crimes that were unimaginable in the past times. The concentration camps, the Third Reich, for example, all the crimes carried out under the name of socialist utopia, or the decades-long um, hostility between between Soviet Union and the United States, during which a lot of different countries were used simply as a place, as a battleground where these two nations, where these two superpowers can fight. So, if religion was indeed a source of violence, then why, in the 20th century, which was by far the most less religious century, did we see such huge, did we see violence on an unprecedented scale? So the bottom line, in my view, is not that religions lead to violence, but that any human endeavor, in particular, any endeavor which leads people to create communities, that has the ability to lead to violence. So Bolsheviks, for example, were a community who caused great deal of terror on others. Same goes for the Jacobins of the French Revolution. So it's not religion which leads to violence. It's rather people and communities that can lead to violence. The other complaint that can be made is that although other ideologies or other beliefs lead to violence, they do not necessarily sanction violence. So the assumption at play here is that certain religions have a built-in structure which sanctifies the use of violence at certain occasions. Now, here we have to be cautious because there are plenty of religions in the world, and not all of them are the same. So the and they are different in many respects. But again, here we have to treat the matter with a great deal of sensitivity. So, for example, the ideas such as pacifism, which we quite thoroughly enjoy, although not all of us are pacifists, but we tend to be under the we tend to treat wars or conquests in a negative fashion. But where does this idea of pacifism comes from? It comes from Christianity. Where does the idea of human brotherhood or human equality comes from? It also comes from Christianity. Typically, when people say religions lead violence, they usually have the impression of Islam as leading to violence, given that what we have seen over the last few decades. And given that this happens to be an area of expertise of mine, and I've written quite a bit on this topic, they do not really understand that the terrorism that's been carried out under the name of Islam has actually very little to do with the classical understanding of Islam. So if you read what the classical jurists had said about the concept of jihad and how it should be conducted, you would realize that the terrorist outfits like ISIS or Al Qaeda, or Taliban, they are totally indifferent to those traditional constraints. They kill non-combatants, something which is prohibited in the classical jurisprudence, and they indulge in a lot of many other things which are also not sanctified in the traditional Islamic understanding. Rather, in fact, I was reading John Gray, the British philosopher who teaches at the London School of Economics, the other day, and he made a very right point that the Islamism, or the political Islam, is not really a product of Islam per se. Rather, it's a product more of Western modernity. Islam, like most of the religions, do not put forward the concept of violent revolution, the idea that human societies can be transformed through convulsive revolutions which involve a huge deal of terror. This is an idea which comes from the French Revolution. Even the previous revolutions or the previous human eras never had this idea that human societies can be transformed through certain acts of terror, through systematic use of terror. This is an idea which is derived from the Jacobins, and the same idea was utilized by Lenin and Stalin and Hitler as well. And political Islam, rather being a reaction against modernity, which it often pretends to be, is basically another iteration of this modernist dogma, which is why the Islamists, can blow up buildings, can blow up mosques without having any sense of repentance in their hearts, without um, feeling any kind of remorse. This is not a religious behavior at all, because a religious believer is obliged to obey certain fixed moral constraints, certain fixed moral norms. So a religious person is not someone who believes dialectically, which is to say, who believes that certain actions can be right if they meet certain political objectives, because then it would imply that there are no fixed moral truths. Rather, they can one can be rather one action which is right in one respect can be utterly wrong in another respect. So, for example, uh, both um, Trotsky and Lenin justified the slaughtering of the children of the Tsar, the Russian monarchs. And the justification they gave was that such an act was politically expedient, politically desirable. And same goes for the horrendous crimes committed against the Jews by Hitler Germany, which also made the similar arguments. So the political Muslims, the political Islam has a fairly similar structure. It is more Leninist in its ethos than Islamic. Not many people realize that. And why are they? Because the political Islam believes that establishing a political system is the most important religious objective. Therefore, they are willing to go to every extent to justify. They're willing to go to every extent to materialize their objective. But never has been in the traditional understanding of Islam has there ever been has there ever been this idea that establishing a political system is a is the prime objective of Islam. Politics is central to Islam, unlike in Christianity, which tends to create a distinction between religion and politics. Islam, however, has never maintained this distinction, has never believed in the idea that human certain human activities, can be beyond the realm of the um, uh, divine authority or divine influence. So, but many people conflate this political dynamics of Islam with political Islam, and they think they are the same. No, because in the traditional Islam, although the politics were intertwined with religion, um, political uh, system was never. There was no such thing, first of all, as a political system. But political injunctions of Islam were never um, considered superior to the more soteriological spiritual, eschatological aspect of the religion. But in political Islam, since it emerges out of the 20th century and is in a great to a great extent a reaction against the competing political systems of the 20th century, thus it carries that structure of modernity in itself, which leads to violence. But since it is being carried out under the name of Islam, many people use it as a means to depict Islam as a religion which promotes terrorism or which promotes huge crime, huge and catastrophic um, crimes. But as I said, this is a false understanding. To wrap it up, then, I believe that it's not religion which leads to violence. Rather, it is a human tendency to create, to indulge in violence. So, if religious, if less, if the decrease in religiosity was by any means a guarantee that violence would decrease, then certainly 20th century should have been the least violent century of all. But it's quite obviously the opposite. And even today, religion is on the back foot, pretty much. And yet people still continue to blame religion, whereas most of the conflicts, even today, are secular in nature.